This talk and the next talk are going to be, again, about a case study. And this case study is going to be looking at two of the 10 terms that we outlined in the talk last time. This particular case study is on Jane Goodall, amazingly creative woman, one of the really most outstanding contributors to science in the 20th century. So the key word we're going to be looking at in this talk is optimism. We discussed that a little bit in our discussion of the 10 terms last time. A very, very important part of creative problem solving is optimism. So as we look at Jane Goodall in this talk, I want you to focus on what really could have made this woman so optimistic, because this was a real key to her creativity. She could not have done what she did without this phenomenal capability of optimism. So Jane Goodall was born in 1934 in London, and her father was a very famous race car driver. His name was Mortimer Goodall, and he was the only driver ever to do 11 sequential Le Mans races. So he was quite a successful and well-known race car driver. And part of being a race car driver is having some capabilities that I think he passed on to Jane. For one thing, he was physically very, very strong. He had a lot of stamina. He had a lot of tenacity. These long, 20-hour races that he sometimes did, they required incredible physical capability. And Jane Goodall definitely had that kind of stamina and physical capability. Also, to be a race car driver, you have to take some risks, and yeah, Jane Goodall also had a lot of risk-taking in her as well. There were good things about Mortimer Goodall as a father. He certainly gave her some of these great capabilities, but he also was gone a whole lot because of his job. And her parents divorced actually when she was fairly young, and she lived with her mom. Her mom was Van Goodall, and she was mostly a stay-at-home mom, but a really remarkable woman who was just best friends with Jane for her whole life. They were super tight, really close. Her mom also was a very good writer, and she kind of passed that on to Jane as well. Now, Jane was born in 1934. In 1939, England began to be at war with Germany. And the Blitz, this big bombing raid that the Germans promulgated on London, began in 1939. So it was very dangerous to be in London. Her family, her mom and her sister Judy, the three of them moved out to her maternal grandmother's farm to try to weather out the war. And so that was a huge change. At age 5, she moved out to this farm. And that farm was owned by her grandmother, and there were 2 maiden aunts who lived there as well, Aunt Audrey and Aunt Ollie. So it was really a very matriarchal society. It was the 3 women in Jane's family and the 3 women that were already out on the farm. So these 6 women are doing everything. And Jane said the entire time she was growing up, nobody ever told me I couldn't do anything because I was a girl, because everything was done by women. In her world, it was all women. So she never had a thought that she couldn't do something because she was a girl. She grew up on this farm and just loved animals. When she was a tiny little girl, her father had given her a stuffed animal that was a chimpanzee. And she just fell in love with this chimpanzee. It was called Jubilee, and it commemorated a chimp that had been born in the London Zoo. It's very unusual, it was very unusual then for a primate to be born in captivity. And so they had this birth of the chimpanzee in the London Zoo. They made a big deal of it, and there were these commemorative stuffed animals made, and Jane's father gave her one. You pressed its belly and it played a tune. And it was just Jane's favorite toy when she's two or 3 years old. Then she always had lots of pets. She's out on a farm beginning at age 5, so she is able to have a menagerie of pets out there. She wanted to learn to ride horses, and she did. This was not, her family didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have any horses on their farm, but there was a stable nearby, and she wanted to learn how to ride horses, and so she made a bargain with the people who ran the stable that she would shovel shit from the stalls in exchange for the ability to learn how to ride horses, and so she did that. She also had a whole series of dogs as pets. One time, her family of origin had some money. Her immediate family kind of didn't have any money anymore, but an uncle who had some means gave her this elaborate dollhouse for her birthday. And he thought, lovely little girl, she'll enjoy this dollhouse. Well, Jane wasn't really into dolls that much. So she asked her mom if she could sell the dollhouse and buy a dog. So she did that, sold the doghouse, and she bought this dog named Rusty, who was really just her companion for all of her time growing up, and even into adulthood. Rusty was a very, very close companion. She also was very curious about all the farm animals. There's a story about her when she's 5 years old, where they just moved out to the farm and little Jane goes missing and nobody can find Jane. And they're scurrying around, they're getting really worried. They call the police in, the police come and they scour the whole district and they can't find Jane. She's been gone for 4 or 5 hours and she's just a little kid. And finally Jane appears and she's got straw in her blonde hair, and it turns out that she went to the chicken coop and she laid down flat on the floor of the chicken coop and looked up at the chickens roosting there because she wanted to know how a chicken laid an egg. She couldn't figure out how this egg came out of that chicken. So for 5 hours she sat there patiently waiting for the chickens to get accustomed to her being in there, and then watched a chicken lay an egg. So clearly it's a kid who has this real interest in animals. Her favorite books were all animal books. She liked Tarzan of the Apes. She liked Dr. Dolittle, where he talks to the animals. She loved Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. So all of these books about Africa, about wild animals, she was fascinated with that. She started a little club among her friends called the Alligator Club, and they all took on identities of different animals, and they tried to raise money to help horses. At a certain point, horses got too old to do the useful things they did around the farm, and so they just put them down. And Jane thought that was terrible, and so she helped raise a little money with her Alligator Club to pay for feed for some of these horses so they wouldn't have to put them down. So you can just get this picture of this kid growing up and having this enormous affection for animals. She did really well in school. She won a lot of writing prizes. She was a very capable student. But in this era, it wasn't an easy time for women, and there weren't many opportunities really for careers. And so her mom suggested that instead of going to college, she go to secretarial school. She said, if you learn secretarial capabilities, how to type, how to take shorthand, this will be useful, and you can be a secretary anywhere in the world. Anything you do for the rest of your life, this will make you an income. So because they didn't have much money, she went to secretarial school. And that was in London. She got a job working for Oxford University as a secretary, hated her job, hated being a secretary. Finally moved back into London and got a job with a film studio. She enjoyed that job a whole lot, but it didn't pay much. She's living in a crappy basement apartment with no windows, She's barely making ends meet. So it was really tough living in London at the time. Turns out because her family had money and they had some social standing, her mom insisted she be a debutante. So she goes through the whole debutante thing in London. She's presented to the Queen. And then she goes back to her job that pays nothing in her apartment in the basement where she's miserable. She also she's dating a lot of guys in this era, dates a lot of guys. She's very attractive, wonderful personality, smart person. And there's this one guy that just totally falls for her. His name is Keith, and he wants her to marry him. And this would have been the natural thing. She's 22 years old. This would solve a lot of problems. His family's got money. He's got a really good education. She could settle into a really nice life. But about that time, her dog Rusty, back on the farm, dies. And she'd been going back and visiting, and Rusty was really close. And somehow when Rusty died, she felt liberated. Like, okay, maybe now I don't really even need to stay here. Maybe I can go to Africa like I've always dreamed of doing. And so at age 22, she tells Keith, nope, at least right now, I'm not going to marry you. I've got to go off and have this adventure. She had a friend from school whose family had a farm in Kenya. So she made arrangements to go and visit the farm in Kenya. That would allow her to sort of get her feet on the ground in Africa and then spend a little time there. So this opened a new chapter in Jane's life. So Jane, at age 23, makes this pilgrimage to Africa. And she spends a few weeks at her friend's farm, but then moves into Nairobi and gets a job as a secretary. Just like her mom said, you can go anywhere and be a secretary. And she met some people, and someone told her, you really need to get to know this guy, Louis Leakey. He's interested in animals in Africa, and he just, is a treasure trove of information about Africa. So she makes an appointment. She goes to meet Louis Leakey. Louis Leakey is a pretty famous guy. He has a PhD from Cambridge in anthropology. He is the director of the National Museum of Kenya, which is a natural history museum in Nairobi. He's written 8 books on Africa. He is an African. He's a white guy, but his parents were missionaries. He was born in Africa and really, really knew Africa extraordinarily well. And Jane just loves having these conversations with Louis Leakey. And he invites her to go on one of his digs. He's an archaeologist primarily, and he is going on a dig to Olguvai, which is one of the places where the first human civilization was thought to be. So she just totally loves that. And Louis Leakey is interested, he's an archaeologist, he's looking at old bones of human beings, but he's interested in the connection between primates and human beings. So right before there were human beings, what were primates' life like? And nobody had really studied that, but he mentioned that to Jane, and Jane thought, wow, that's really fascinating. How do primates organize themselves? How do they make communities? And she'd always had this sense that animals were really kind of like human beings. She swore that Rusty, had feelings and empathy, and she just felt like we didn't understand the way animals are like human beings. So she says, man, I would love to participate in any kind of research like that. But of course, she has no qualifications to do this at all. She didn't even have a college degree. She's went to secretarial school. But Louis Leakey says, well, maybe we could get you some funding to do this. And he makes a few tries, but it's just not happening. And Jane kind of runs out of money and decides she has to go back to London. So she goes back to London, gets a job at the London Zoo, which of course she loved. And she's working there in their film department and doing really well, but still has this itch for Africa. And finally, she stays in communication with Louis Leakey, and he begins to get a little funding he thinks he can send her way to let her begin to study chimpanzees. And he has in mind this particular reserve, which is the Gombe Stream Reserve that's in Tanzania, where the chimpanzees have been living there unspoiled by human civilization for millennia. And so it's just the perfect spot to do this study. So he gets a little bit of funding for her. She goes back down to Africa. Turns out she's required by the Tanzanian government to have an escort. You know, she didn't really need or want an escort, but she gets her mom to come and be the escort. Well, they of course expected a guy, not her mom, but they couldn't dispute it because it didn't specify it had to be a guy. So her mom and she go to do this study in the wilds of Tanzania. They do a little bit of preliminary work before they go down there on an island where there were vervet monkeys near to Nairobi. So she's kind of working out techniques there. And there really had been no one who'd done serious study of chimpanzees. There's a guy named Henry Nissen who had done a little bit of work in the 1930s. And the way he did his work was he did like a deer stand where you're in a box and it's got little holes you can look out of, and you hope that those chimpanzees will come near enough so you can observe what their life is like. He actually got some really bad conclusions out of that study, and it really wasn't a very good way to observe these animals in their natural habitat. So there really were three ways that people had done this with other animals. One was that kind of being in a box or a retreat and looking out at the animals. A second way was baiting the animals, feeding them, and that way they would come close to you and you could observe them. But then of course you're interfering with their life. You're already intervening, and it's not their natural life because you've made this place for them to eat. And then the third way that they normally did this was where they were kind of stalking the animals. They'd try to stay a distance away and kind of follow them and try to be unobtrusive. But the animals kind of knew they were there and they'd run away from them, and that was also not a very satisfying way to study these animals. So Jane's, with these vervet monkeys on the island, she's experimenting with, is there some other way to do this? And she comes up with this, what she calls habituation, where what if I'm just another animal in the forest? I just have to spend the time there and be there long enough for them to get used to me, just like they get used to a baboon or a lion or a zebra or whatever. And then they'd carry on with their life and they wouldn't pay attention to me, but I'd be able to be in their milieu. So she commits herself to do this habituation, which is of course a much longer term kind of thing. And she actually was there for 3 months in Gombe Stream before she even got the very first chimpanzee to begin to interact with her or begin to let her get close without running away. And this was a chimpanzee called David Graybeard, who became a very good friend of hers. But it took a really long time for the animals, the chimpanzees, to not be afraid of her or not be freaked out, and to just accept her as a part of the milieu there in the forest. So she's there, she's 26 years old. Her mom actually goes back to London. She's there in the forest by herself. God, it's a hard life. It's, there are all kinds of, it's tropical forest, it's hot, there's all kinds of mosquitoes and bugs and bites, and she gets diseases. She gets malaria 8 times. Malaria is a horrible illness. She's struggling there in the forest, but she's always extremely optimistic. She writes letters back to her mom, and I've read some of those letters, and she's just like, yeah, this was super, and that's kind of her favorite word is super, and yeah, I've got malaria, but I saw this and this, and it's super. So she's extremely optimistic. And and in the midst of a lot of hardship. And she also it's very, very hard to get consistent funding. She got a little at the beginning from Louis Leakey, but it's, she needs resources. And she's doing everything on a shoestring. She doesn't have very good equipment. And it's a struggle. But she's out there and she's doing this work and she's extremely optimistic. So in terms of the 10 terms that we had at the first half of the semester, she's classic on a lot of these. Definitely independent thinking. Man, this is a woman who, she has no college education and she's, trying to do this scientific study. And anybody, if she'd ask anybody, should I be doing, no, you're totally ill-equipped. But she's independent thinking. Even when she looks at, well, how have people done this before? I don't think any of those really work. And she invents this new way of studying, this habituation. She's independent thinking. The kind of confidence, man, 26-year-old woman in the wilds of Africa by herself, most people would be scared to death. But she has the confidence, I can handle this. I can make this work. Definitely rebellious. Oh my gosh, this is not what a young woman is supposed to be doing. There was a track for her. Marry Keith, have some babies, lead a nice life in London. But she was very rebellious to that. Nope, I've got another way of doing things, and she's out in Africa. But the thing I want us to focus on for a minute here is, where the hell did she get to be so optimistic? And the optimism was absolutely critical. If she had not been optimistic, she could not have persevered out there. It gave her tenacity, and it gave her commitment to see this thing through. And how does she have this idea, as we described optimism, that good is going to triumph over evil? I'm going to get something good out of this instead of just being beat down by all these obstacles. Where did that come from? And I want you to think about that for our check-in discussion. Where does optimism come from? How can we be more optimistic? And I'd like you to think about 3 things maybe in Jane's life. One is she grows up in this household where they're having hardships. It's the middle of World War II. Life is not easy. They don't have a lot of financial resources. And yet everything works out good. Her mom, her grandma, these people are resilient and they make things happen. I think that gave her an optimism that in the midst of hardship, you can overcome, you can be resilient, you can make things work out. Another thing is she tended to surround herself with optimistic people. Louis Leakey was this extremely optimistic guy, and he had this can-do attitude too. And she was inspired by that. She put herself in a milieu where other optimistic people could reinforce her. And then the third thing is I think she just decided, if I'm going to accomplish this, I've got to be optimistic. I've got to have a positive attitude. And that certainly was part of her acquiring this kind of optimism. So I truly believe in a creative age, we need optimism as one of the tools in our toolkit. How can we learn from Jane Goodall how optimism works and how we can incorporate it in our own creative problem solving? Okay, see you next time.